his actions. Louis Gregory made a very bold action. I think the boldest action of his life for racial amity was in the first decade of the 1900s, when he declared his faith in Baha'u'llah, whose pivot of his faith is the oneness of humankind. Before the Baha'i era, humanity lived very distantly in all different continents, widely divided, unable to communicate. But now we're one human family living together, and it's time for us to establish the oneness of humankind on earth. And the question was, how did Louis think, how did he reflect on the faith he put in to Baha'u'llah? And in 1934, we get an indication of this when he wrote to his friend, W.E.B. Du Bois. And he wrote to him on this topic. And I think what it shows is that his faith was vindicated. That after living this faith for all these years, he felt it's true. He wrote to Du Bois, "When a person accepts the faith, he must abandon all prejudices. The Baha'i faith's mysterious power is indicated by its ability to transform people whose views are diametrically opposed to its ideals, and to give them new minds and new hearts. It is here in the South, uniting the races, as nothing else has ever done or can do. It is creating the bond that is permanent, not the ephemeral bond of the old order." Incredible. Incredible. In the next decade, Louis Gregory made a mental leap so we don't have to. He was friends with many individuals, like Louise Matthew, who's pictured here, his wife. And he was asked, "Do you love her?" And like many social liberals, they will say, "I have friends from many races." And that's a comforting distance between you and them. And Louis Gregory had to think for a moment when Abdu'l-Baha said, "Do you wish to marry her?" Abdu'l-Baha is the appointed leader of the Baha'i faith at the time. And Louis Gregory described that he had to think for 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, he did the thinking that none of us now have to do. He said, "If I love all these people, are they really my family? Because if they are your family, you will certainly consider any one of them as a marriage prospect. You won't draw a division." And he didn't, and they married. And Abdu'l-Baha was so happy. The appointed leader of the Baha'i faith revealed a prayer for this occasion of their marriage that helps indicate its importance for humankind. "Verily, they are married in obedience to thy command. Cause them to become the signs of unity and harmony until the end of time." And as we saw in his family, they still honor that, as many of us do. And I hope some of you pick up those flowers to attest to your own relationship, the race amity rose. And then the next decade, he did something remarkable. He had great courage. He had already brought the faith to the capital of the Confederacy, to the cradle of the Confederacy here in South Carolina, who was fearless where he would take the message of race amity. In the 1920s, when what Dr. Martin Luther King called the foremost philosopher of American history, Dr. Alain Locke, when he was at the height of his fame as the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, publishing The New Negro, proving that Americans of African descent can have achievement in all of the arts, he spent both the summer of 1925 and 1926 with Louis, traveling in the South, teaching race amity fearlessly, with two of the greatest minds in the country doing so, two of the greatest souls. But in the next decade, Louis went one further and became the first freedom rider. William McKay, who traveled with him on the second of those trips, describes Louis Gregory's own words as he told to them. As they traveled together, one man of European descent, one man of African descent throughout the South, 20, 30 years before the freedom riders most of us know. Here's what Willard McKay recorded. I shall always think of it as the trip. Lewis thinks this is the first time a colored man and a white man have traveled together on terms of equality through the southern states, riding together in public conveyance. Lewis Gregory, the Freedom Rider. Now, Lewis Gregory was approaching his 70s. His health was deteriorating. He suffered a stroke. So it was time for him to retire. But his retirement still stands for Race Amity. He went to Green Acre, which is a sister institution of this Lewis Gregory Baha'i Institute in Elliott, Maine. And there he helped coordinate and help teach in Race Amity conferences in 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945, 1946. So when you all think about yourself as you retire, be like Lewis Gregory and continue to work for Race Amity. And the week after his final talk at Green Acre, he passed away, and his wife and his headstone now sit in Elliott, Maine as an American monument to Race Amity for all of us to go there whenever we need to remember him, to honor him, or be inspired by him. So finally, I want to conclude by moving to his writing. Lewis Gregory, after he graduated from Avery, went to another school set up by the American Missionary Association called Fisk. And in Fisk, the printing press was still warm, where E.B. Du Bois, his future friend, had set up the Fisk Herald, its newspaper. But unlike others who might think of a newspaper, E.B. Du Bois also thought of how to sustain it, teaching the students how to market to the local businesses, bring in the prosperity, the growing prosperity of the liberation community to share amongst each other. And then his students, effectively E.B. Du Bois students, the graduates of Fisk who participated in the Herald, spread across the South, filling the void created by 40 years of apartheid, when we had no Race Amity newspapers. And Lewis Gregory was no different. In 1898, when he graduated, he came to Charleston and established the Afro-American Citizen. And for today, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Lewis Gregory Baha'i Institute, he has reestablished, I have reprinted this newspaper for the first time in 120 years. So I need some child to be my newsboy or newsgirl and hand this paper out. Here he comes. Let's give him a round of applause. This is a newsboy cap. Take these newspapers and please share them with those in the audience who put their hand up. And keep one for yourself. And Lewis Gregory dedicated this newspaper to the upliftment of the country. And you'll see in that newspaper he covers international issues. And thereafter, in 1911, he opened his next book, which was a next publication, which was a publication about his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And he said, I wrote this book and I published this book because I wanted the world to see the truth of the Baha'i faith, what it offers on the topic of race amity. And he was very clear in his introduction of why he wrote that book. And then in 1928, for the first time ever, he compiled all the writings of the Baha'i faith on the topic of race amity to share in a publication with the world. So he similarly wrote in another publication on the history of race amity in America. In another publication, he wrote Many Races or One in 1930. So he has a volume of writing. And I wish to share with you, in closing, one of these writings which describes a situation like today. Thank you very much. He describes this situation, which is what place does race Hamity have in a situation like today? And he wrote these words in 1925 in an article entitled The Religion for Today. In a world often shaken by struggle and change, when the passions of warring factions are so often raised to a white heat, the true glory of religion may be for a time concealed, but the spiritually minded may discern even in these violent outward changes the wrecking of ancient barriers and the passing of superstitions. Thus is marked the transition to a new world order in which religion will have full sway. This mystic power must inspire man, mold his ideals, create his inventions, reform his morals, uplift his civilization, and guide his destiny before he can really come into his own, the knowledge of himself and the author of his being. So all of us can now think about Louis Gregory this weekend and how our own publications, as we're all now social media publishers, how we can publish on race amity. How all of us can consider, am I on this side of social liberalism, where I say I have many friends of all races? Or have I now seen them as family, where I intermarry with them? I encourage my children to intermarry them, my grandchildren to intermarry with them, to truly live as Louis Gregory did, as one family. And also please be inspired by his actions at every turn. Every day is a chance to express your race amity in this country that needs it, and be inspired by him. So thank you all for your attention today.
So now I do have a couple of announcements. One, if you have served at the Louis Gregory Baha'i Institute in any capacity, raise your hand. Let's give them a hand. Thank you. Thank you. Two, we have a table over here where the programs are, but there's also a guest sign-in. We would like for you all to sign in and write down the best way to contact you. We have a program committee for Louis Gregory Baha'i Institute, and Charlie Spain is on the program committee, and he's standing with his red jacket on. We're waiting for you to come and sign in if you haven't already signed in, or sign in before you leave. Ernie Hilton is also on the program committee, and he's back here with the technical people. And Jay Burgess has agreed to do all this technical stuff like streaming that I have no idea what he's doing. Hey Jay, thank you Jay. He and Wendy Burgess' daughter, Kanika, is helping. Thank you, Kanika. Ernie is pointing to somebody. Gregory. Oh, Gregory is helping over here. Thank you, Gregory. Now a test. When my new friend Lex said where Louis Gregory came from originally, where was that? What? So, guess where I'm from? I did know that. For those of you who are newly arrived, the bathroom's over here. Programs at the table over here. Sign in also at the table over here. And I think, Charlie, Ernie, anything else I need to announce? Oh, I know one thing. You see these beautiful programs Aaliyah Willis did the programs. Aaliyah, raise your hand. Yes. If you didn't hear her, anyone who would like any literature about Baha'i faith, there's a table over here, and you're welcome to take any of that literature. There was something else. My mind just left me. Okay, well, I'll have another opportunity. Now I want to introduce my long-term friend. That would be Louis Venters. I've known Louis since he was a teenager, maybe? Yeah. Come on up, Louis. He's our next speaker. Oh, yeah. That was the other thing I wanted to say. Whoever put this here, thank you, Lord.
Yes, indeed. Lex was moving around everywhere. I'm going to stay put right here for my comments. No, I'm going to stay put right here for my comments because I need to read. I fear that if I try to speak extemporaneously, I'll get away from myself. Thank you all so much, everybody who helped plan this event. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate. This is really a pleasure. I've been asked to talk about the early years of the Louis Gregory Baha'i Institute. Does this sound okay to y'all? So I hear a little bit of an echo. I just want to make sure. Okay, all right. So I was asked to speak about the early years of the Institute, which I think was supposed to mean basically the 1970s. But the more I thought about it, the more I reflected on the span of history, I came to the realization that if we truly appreciate what has happened here, then we must know that its effects will ripple down across the ages. Future generations, many centuries from now, will still gather on these hallowed grounds and say that these first 50 years were truly just the beginning. So with that conviction in mind, during the next 30 minutes or so, I'll try to share first something about the why of the Louis Gregory Institute in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And then something about the what and the how of the Institute since its founding in 1972. Obviously, this can't be a full or adequate treatment of such an important phase of our state and national Baha'i community's history. There is so much more research to be carried out, so much more individual and collective reflection and discernment as we strive continually to find ourselves, to understand better who we are and whence we came, to have a clear sense of what has happened in the past, to identify lessons from our experience so that we can move forward with confidence to make our distinctive contributions to the unfolding of a new civilization. Since our time is so short, I would like to refer a few books to your study that I think are really essential to this work. And obviously, first, the messages of the Universal House of Justice. To those, however, I would add Century of Light, which was prepared under the supervision of the House of Justice and published in 2001, particularly Chapter 9, that analyzes the processes that were unleashed with the establishment of the Supreme Body in 1963. As well as the short book, Learning About Growth, the Story of the Ruhi Institute and Large-Scale Expansion of the Baha'i Faith in Colombia, which was published in 1991. I believe that these are among the indispensable frames of reference for Baha'i communities at all levels everywhere as they strive to understand and articulate their own history and identity. And for South Carolina and the Deep South in particular, I would like to recommend Annette Reynolds' book, Trudy and the Baha'i Spiritual Path in South Carolina, which started out as a rather straightforward biography of one of our greatest teachers and administrators, Trudy White, but in the process became an invaluable collection of primary sources about the South Carolina community as a whole. And I would also recommend my second book, A History of the Baha'i Faith in South Carolina, which was published in 2019. This is a brief overview of the South Carolina Baha'i community in its first century from 1910 to 2010. And the last 3 chapters contain really the first published attempt to understand the large-scale growth that took place here beginning in 1970. And I would add, it's very dear to my heart, it also contains some of the really moving visual record of these decades in the form of about 80 photographs and images, many of which have never been published before. And also I would point out very important background and important stories in the memoirs by Lynn Bryant, Richard Abercrombie, who is right here with us, and June Thomas's new book, Struggling to Learn, which is part memoir, part family history, part state history, and includes sort of relationships between the civil rights movement and the emergence of the Baha'i community. Oh, and I see Lynn as well. So please, there's work out there that ought to inform all of our discussions as we come to terms with our history and think about our future. Okay, so first, the why of the Louis Gregory Institute. Fundamentally, I think this place, these buildings, are an outward manifestation of the call that runs through the whole revelation of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, that all the peoples of the earth should arise to help build a new spiritual social order of justice and peace and universal rights. That those who have been on the outside shall come in, and the whole world shall be made new and whole from the bottom up. And of course, as we just heard from Lex, my old friend, this is the vision that first attracted Mr. Gregory to the Baha'i faith more than 110 years ago. And it was in service to this same vision that he spent the rest of his life building local and national Baha'i institutions and spreading the Baha'i teachings across the country, including to his beloved home state of South Carolina. And it was this same vision that inspired a new generation of teachers beginning in the late 1960s to launch the process of large-scale growth of the faith in the Deep South, particularly in rural areas and among the large population of African descent, that led to the establishment of this institute and to an unprecedented transformation of the character, organization, and aspirations of the Baha'i movement in the United States as a whole. To appreciate the specific impulse that led to the establishment of this institute, we need to appreciate the new vistas that opened up with the establishment of the Universal House of Justice in 1963. Recall that most of the faith's growth outside of Iran up to that point had taken the form of Baha'is visiting or taking up residence in a new town or city and attracting a little circle of new believers and then establishing a local spiritual assembly that would gradually emerge and be nurtured and then take on the responsibility of fostering the growth of that community and perhaps some nearby localities. This had been the basic pattern of growth in many places, including the United States. And through this method, the faith had spread, despite extraordinary challenges associated with the Jim Crow regime. The faith had spread across the Deep South in the first half of the 20th century. By the 1960s, in South Carolina, there were local Baha'i communities in several places. They were distinctive for their interracial character. They were tightly connected to each other. And even in some places, notably such as Greenville, they were attempting to reach out and influence the life of society, particularly by supporting the local civil rights movement. But numerically, they were very, very small. Now, as soon as the Universal House of Justice was established, it began to lay down the outlines of a new vision, a new approach, a far-reaching approach that would focus on discovering the means of helping large numbers of people, indeed entire populations, to embrace the faith and apply its teachings. They called for a huge expansion of the cause of God that would enable the Baha'i community to more fully reflect the diversity and cultural richness of the human race and exert more of a transformative effect on society at all levels. And in particular, the House of Justice directed national Baha'i communities across the globe to broaden the scope of their endeavors and their resources, focusing on bringing the faith to the masses of mankind that resided primarily in villages and rural areas. In the United States, in South Carolina, this guidance came at the high point of the civil rights movement and of the dramatic social and political upheavals in the 1960s. So we can say that the impulse for growth that was coming from within the Baha'i faith itself met a moment of unprecedented change in American society at large. And the result over the next decade or more was a dramatic growth in membership across the country, particularly among young people and racial minorities, that permanently changed the identity and structures and the future prospects of the Baha'i faith in the United States. And the epicenter of this movement was in South Carolina. Our time doesn't really permit a detailed discussion of how all this came about. So I'll just say briefly that by the late 1960s, new opportunities for teaching seemed to be opening up in the South, and particularly among African Americans, and with the guidance and support of the National Spiritual Assembly, and with the very intimate involvement of the Hands of the Cause of God, a cadre of mostly young Baha'is experimented with new teaching techniques that had been pioneered in such places as Uganda and Indonesia and Bolivia, and which also borrowed from the language and the music and the organizing strategies of the civil rights movement and the emerging youth culture in the United States. And indications were that something big was about to happen to the Baha'is. As Glenford Mitchell, who was then the Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly, put it, after one training conference held at Penn Center on St. Helena Island early in 1970, the youth were, quote, so ablaze with the love of God, so uninhibited, that I don't think we will have any trouble in bringing in numbers. We may have trouble in managing the statistics. Little did he or anyone else know at the time how true his assessment, both parts of his assessment, would prove to be. To make a, I hear who's laughing over there. Yes, very true on both counts. To make a very long and amazing story short, there were two major teaching campaigns that transformed the faith in South Carolina and the United States virtually overnight. The high point of a phenomenon that one scholar of religion has aptly named the South Carolinian Pentecost. I was not that scholar of religion, by the way. That's somebody else. The first of these was a 3-month campaign, really a network of state projects that was coordinated by the National Spiritual Assembly's Deep South Committee during the winter of 1970-1971. And there were very good and solid results everywhere, but nobody was prepared for what was going to happen in South Carolina. The project in South Carolina was based in Dillon, here in the northeast corner of the state. And even before the project ended, the front page of the January 1971 issue of the American Baha'i announced the national community's greatest teaching victory ever, with some 6,000 new believers in the Carolinas achieved within 2 weeks. Most of the new Baha'is, go ahead. Most of the new Baha'is were African Americans, but there were also whites and indigenous people, particularly in this area, PDs and Lumbis. Later the same month, the Universal House of Justice, rather ecstatically, I must say, shared the news from South Carolina, including the latest tally of new believers with the worldwide community via telegram. So forgive me, I'll quote it, and this is telegram speech. Joyfully announce process entry by troops accelerating United States. Evidenced by enrollment 8,000 new believers, South Carolina, course 6 weeks campaign. Raising number new believers entire country, 13,000 since Rezwan. Process gathering momentum. Indications, similar developments occurring new areas, North, South America. By the spring of that year, 1971, the National Spiritual Assembly could report that all the domestic expansion goals of the 9-year plan had not only been met, but exceeded 2 years ahead of schedule. We might as well clap now because it's going to get complicated here in a minute. Baha'i membership in the United States had more than doubled in a single administrative year, with most of the new adherents, some 20,000, residing in the Deep South alone. To give just an indication of what this change looked like in South Carolina, in 1970, there were about 200 Baha'is in the state and 8 local spiritual assemblies. By the spring of 1971, there were 108 local spiritual assemblies, more than any other state in the country, and the National Center was literally still trying to count the new believers, right? As dramatic and really unexpected as these results had been, the Universal House of Justice and the Hands pressed the American community not to stop for a moment, but to continue the work in the Deep South and to carry the very same approach into other parts of the country and especially to other minority groups. So it was in this context that in early 1972 came the second major teaching campaign that was called the Army of Light. It was designed in large part by Hand of the Cause Rahmatullah Muhajir. And it was meant both to consolidate the gains from the year before in the Dillon campaign and also to bring large-scale growth to other parts of South Carolina where it had yet to occur. And it began in North Augusta, on the opposite side of the state from Dillon, and proceeded roughly eastward. They had very specific goals for increasing the number of local spiritual assemblies, opening up new localities to the faith, training new believers, involving children in all the community's activities, and, quote, strengthening the social fabric and quality of Baha'i life. By the end of the year, the results were felt across everywhere in the state. From Greenville, one of the state's oldest Baha'i communities, where some 300 people embraced the faith during the Army of Light, and there were Baha'i activities in multiple neighborhoods virtually every day of the week, to Aner, a town of just a few hundred people near here in Horry County, where a brand new Baha'i community